Good morning, everyone. Sorry for the delay, the little technical problems. Good morning, nice to see you all, and as always, thank you for joining. I've done the normal format of muting everyone unless you have questions, in which case, obviously, please feel free to unmute yourselves. The topic we were looking at was that of Das Torah, the extent and parameter of rabbinic authority. We discussed last week how, first of all, I mean, this is a sugya, a topic that needs to be learnt. In halachic terms, what exactly is the authority given to rabbonim, to rabbinic authority? And also we discussed how the term Das Torah is often used and unclearly defined. And we spoke about thinking of it as a spectrum of sort of associated ideas rather than referring to one particular specifically defined concept. We spoke about it being something to do with reliability, a sort of assumption of no or very limited mistakes, about a breadth of authority. As you drift towards the Das Torah believing end of the spectrum, one might grant ever broader authority to rabbinic figures, perhaps a mistrust of self and a reduction in self-autonomy, sort of a suspicion of one's own abilities to arrive at reasonable decisions due to negias, bias, limited understanding of Torah, linked perhaps to not needing to bring classic sources as one would in a normal halachic teshuvah, linked perhaps to an obligation, a chiyuv to listen, perhaps also something that's only specifically relevant to the greatest of the great, not every Talmud Chacham, and also perhaps linked to a belief that this is somehow beyond normal human reason, perhaps above the derech hateva, the natural way of the world, associated with Ruach HaKodesh. So these are some of the cluster of 7 or 8 ideas connected with Das Torah. There's not necessarily that one has to believe in all of them, but as one edges towards greater belief in Das Torah, one wants to believe in a larger amount of these ideas and take them to a greater extent. This was the ideas that we discussed last week, and we looked at some of the classic and more contemporary statements that have been made around this topic. The very last source we looked at was that of Rav Dessler, who grounded the concept of rabbinic authority and the extent of rabbinic authority, particularly of the Gedolim, in the pasuk which we actually looked at previously when we were learning Isurei D'Rabbanan, the pasuk in Sefer Devarim, which talks about rabbinic authority. V'osisa al pi hadavar asher yagidu lecha. One should listen to that which they instruct you, to that which they tell you. Lo sosu min hadavar asher yagidu lecha yomin or smol. Do not veer away from that which they tell you, right or left. So we looked at this pasuk in the context of the authority of the sages to interpret Torah Sheba'al Peh, and not just to interpret Torah Sheba'al Peh, but also to innovate what we call takonos d'Rabbanan or gezeros, takanot, legislation, and gezeros, decrees. And we looked at that when we were learning Torah Sheba'al Peh, and then we looked at that again when we were learning D'Rabbanans. So this is the third part in that sequence, if you like. When we learned Torah Sheba'al Peh, then we learned Rabbanon, now looking at this from the context of modern day rabbinic authority. So let's open a Chumash and Rashi and do some learning together. And I'm going to share my screen to allow us to do this. And we're going to read some psukim together. Surely not a bad thing to do on a Sunday morning. And we'll have a look at what these psukim seem to tell us, because this is an oft-cited source for rabbinic authority in general. And as we said, Rav Dessler in particular highlights this as the source of the concept of Das Torah. So here we are. You should be able now to see the shared screen. Can someone who's got their screen shared just give me a nod if they can see it? Excellent. Okay, so the pasuk says as follows. This is a sequence of psukim in Sefer Devarim in chapter 17, chapter Yud Zayin. Ki yipalei mimcha davar mishpat. If something eludes you, is beyond you in mishpat, bein dam ledam, bein din ledin, or bein nega lo nega, whether involving matters between blood and blood, whether between mishpat, din and din, judgment and judgment, or between nega and nega, plague and plague, divrei rivois bisharecha, words of dispute in your gates, in your cities. V'kamta v'alisa ala mokom asher yivcha Hashem elokecha. You should ascend to the place which God has chosen. Let's read just the Hebrew first, and then we'll look at Rashi's comments. Ubasa ala kohenim, now pasuk 9, halavim v'la shofet asher b'yomim heim. You should go to the kohenim, the Leviim, or to the judge who will be in those days. They will inquire and they'll tell you the rule of mishpat. And now we get to the crucial psukim. You should do according to the word they tell you from that place. You should observe all they instruct. Pasuk 11. Do not veer off the matter they tell you, neither right nor left. Okay, so this is the sequence of psukim granting rabbinic authority, and granting this authority through the device of both a mitzvah aseh, a positive commandment, and a mitzvah lo aseh, a negative commandment. Let's look at pasuk 10 and 11 again. Pasuk 10 is a positive commandment. One should do according to the matter as they instruct you. And pasuk 11, don't veer off. So we have a classic mitzvah saseh and mitzvahs lo saseh, positive and negative commandment. Now what I've said so far is uncontroversial. These are psukim in the Torah. Everything else is more complicated. Because of course there's an enormous number of questions that immediately spring to mind when we learn these psukim. First of all, which Rabbanim are granted these sweeping powers? Is this any Rav, any collection of Rabbanim, only the Sanhedrin? What's the authority? What do we mean when we talk about Chazal? Are all of Chazal included in this category? And who are included in Chazal? Any of Chachamim, Zichronim Racha, any wise deceased figures, or does it refer to a certain era in history? So this is the first question. The second question is, what is the parameters of this rabbinic authority? In any area or only in halachic matters? And if in halachic matters, how broad sweeping a statement is this? I mean, we've already discussed this. Does it refer only to interpretation or even to rabbinic legislation? And if it refers to rabbinic legislation, which rabbinic legislation? So how far does it extend? Does it even go beyond halacha? And within the realm of halacha, what's the extent of this authority? And the final question, which we're not going to discuss today, and quite possibly not even next week, but it's probably a couple of weeks off, is how does this tie in to our topic, Das Torah, Emunas Chachamim? How does this relate to the other broader issues that we want to look at? So these are the questions that I think strike any reader of the psukim as one learns them. And what we're going to do now is learn Rashi's approach to this issue. Rashi is, of course, the first and foremost amongst the commentaries on the Torah. Nonetheless, Rashi isn't the only word on how we understand these psukim. Rashi bases himself on Chazal. Other Rishonim took different interpretations, different stances of the psukim. So we're going to try and learn Rashi's view on these questions. And then we will look, obviously, at the Rambam's view. That's where we always turn next, to the Rambam. And then we'll try and look at a swathe of other Rishonim and Achronim and what they make of these psukim. So first of all, Rashi picks up on Pasuk Ches, Pasuk 8, the extent of rabbinic authority. And we won't look at this Rashi inside, but we'll glance at it briefly inside. But just look at the Pasuk, Pasuk 8, Pasuk Ches. When do I turn to this court that the Torah is referencing, whatever the court is, when something in judgment is beyond us. Now, what are the areas of judgment? Bein dam ledam, between blood and blood, din and din, judgment and judgment, nega lenega, divrei rivos. So the rabbinic authority refers to dam ledam, perhaps referencing kosher and non-kosher blood when eaten, perhaps referencing tomei and tahor blood in the concept of family purity. Bein din ledin, justice. Nega lenega refers to saras, perhaps. Divrei rivos, any matter of argument. Rashi translates, we'll look at that, the words of dispute, divrei rivos, the fourth comment of Rashi. When there's an argument between the sages, the wise people, the judges in the city, one is arguing that it's tomei or tahor or chayav or innocent, guilty or innocent. In all these cases, the comment of Alisa, one should go up to the place which God has chosen, which we understand to refer to Yerushalayim. So this is in Pshuto Shel Mikra, according to Rashi, in the simplest reading of Pesukim according to Rashi, the context of what we're talking about, this refers to matters of debate in halacha, whether that of ritual purity, whether that of justice, whether that of tsaras, whether that of family purity, any matter of argument between the judges of the city. So says the pasuk. Now, who do you turn to at that point? Well, you go to the Makom Asher Yivcha Hashem. Who sits in Yerushalayim? Well, traditionally, this is the Sanhedrin. The seat of the Sanhedrin was in a chamber next to the Beis HaMikdash, next to the temple itself. And indeed, this is the language used, the Kamta Va'alisa, you should ascend. Rashi already points out in his last comment on Pasuk 8, Melamed she Beis HaMikdash Gavoya Mikol HaMakomos. The Beis HaMikdash is Gavoya, is higher than all other places. One ascends to the Beis HaMikdash. This isn't a geographical comment. Rashi references in Devarim something that we know as a geographical fact, and Rashi in faraway North France knew this as well because of his interpretation of Psukim. Har HaBayis is certainly not the highest mountain in the hill range of Hore Yehuda. It's surrounded by a mountain on either side, which is higher than it. So it is true that in Eretz Yisrael, Hore Yehuda are the peaks, and it is true that Yerushalayim is amongst the highest points on Hor Yehuda, but it's certainly not the highest point itself. Okay, so this is Rashi's comment. Someone messaged me directly and says this is only when, as the pasuk says, if a matter eludes you in judgment. That is correct. The pasuk begins ki polim imcha davar mishpat. Something first has to elude you. When we realize that we can't resolve it ourselves, then we need to turn to the Sanhedrin HaGadol. That is also correct, and we'll get back to that. Also, the degree of initiative granted to the Sanhedrin HaGadol. So thank you for that comment. Now, Rashi then makes two further comments in Pasuk Tes, which I'm not going to go into in detail. He picks up on the language Hashofet Asher by Yomim Ha'im. You should turn Pasuk 9 to the judge who will be in those days. To which Rashi says, well, of course you turn to the judge who's in those days. I mean, you can't turn to a judge who hasn't yet been born. You can't turn to a judge who is already dead. And Rashi says this teaches us that one needs to listen to the judge who is in those days, even if they aren't of the same stature as previous judges. Let's have a look at Rashi inside Pasuk Tes. Even if they are not of the same stature as previous judges, nonetheless, one has to listen to one's judge in one's lifetime. One has to turn to the current source of authority. And now we get to the crucial and very, very oft-cited midrashic comment on Pasuk Yud Aleph, because this is a pasuk that you will see all over the place quoted. And on almost every Hutchkeville, every tzattel, every plastered notice that you'll see up on the streets of Yerushalayim and Bnei Brak, when calls are made at particular times, elections in Israel and the like, and different rabbinic bodies wish to issue a pasuk, you'll see these pasukim quoted. Pasuk numbered 1 that you will see is Asisok Cholashe Rucha, everything that they decree that you should do, which is a shortened version of Pasuk Yud, the 10th Pasuk. And the second thing you will see is a shortened version of Pasuk Yud Aleph, Lo sasum and adav asher yagiducha, particularly Yomin or Smol, neither right nor left, because we have a very famous comment of Rashi, bottom of the screen, Yomin or Smol, afilu omelacha, al Yomin shehu Smol, al Yamin shehu Smol. Even if they tell you about the right, that it is the left, va'al Smol shehu Yamin, and on the left that it is the right, one has to listen to them. The kol shkein she'omelacha al Yamin Yamin, va'al Smol Smol. And how much more so if they tell you that right is right and left is left. So this Rashi, quoting more or less a medrash, a sifri, a halachic medrash, says that rabbinic authority extends even in a situation in which they say something about which you are absolutely certain they are wrong. It is clear and obvious they are wrong because they say right is left and left is right. Nonetheless, one has to follow. So this is a source for the idea of rabbinic authority, even against our reason. It goes against every fiber of our being. We are absolutely confident, in our own minds at least, that right is right and left is left. And they say, no, right is left and left is right. Nonetheless, one needs to follow what they say. So I'm going to shut off the screen now, but I will ask you to remember this pasuk and these words of Rashi, because we're going to engage in a analysis of this perspective of Rashi, this quote or partial quote of Chazal that Rashi teaches us. So this is the very, very crucial source text that Rav Dessler referenced and seems to be a very powerful piece of language. Nonetheless, we are still quite far off the concept of Das Torah as applied, because even though Rashi grants a very broad speaking authority, even al Smol Shu Yomin and Yomin Shu Smol, equally, we still have to wonder who is granted this authority. Is it only the Sanhedrin, as per the simplest understanding of Pasuk 9 and Pasuk 10, Min hamokom hahu, from that place, Asher Yivcha Hashem, the chosen place of Hashem, number 1. And number 2, what is the breadth of their authority? Seemingly it's been dam ledam, bein din ledin, bein nega lenega, it's in matters of halacha. So let's take these points one by one and try and understand them a little better. So the first point is a fascinating one. And when one learns Rashi, one needs to know that Rashi was not merely cutting and pasting from Midrashim, but was also interpreting them in a certain way. And it is very rare for Rashi to quote a Medrash directly as cited by the Medrash itself. And the whole craftsmanship of Rashi, and the reason why Rashi rose to such prominence, is his brilliance in choosing which comments of Chazal to quote and not, which ones he feels are necessary for a Peshat interpretation of the Pasuk, and also for often shortening and summarizing and clarifying the language of the sages. Now, what motivates Rashi to comment on this Pasuk? Well, the superfluous words. Lo sosor, don't deviate, min adav asher yagidu, from anything they tell you. Why does it add yomin or smol? Now, there is considerable debate around the concept of Peshat. It's very nice when we talk about Peshat. What's the plain meaning of a pasuk? But the assumptions that you bring to bear about the nature of the pasuk will affect whether you view this as Peshat or what you consider within the parameters of Peshat or not. So, for example, poetic language that's designed to stir the imagination and emotions, picturesque language which is a turn of phrase in human speech. Are these things which are part of the style of how the Torah writes, in which case they don't need extra interpretation? Or no, the Torah is written as a manual. If you found poetry in the technical manual of the instructions of how to use a new app or piece of technology that you purchased, you'd be puzzled. The poetry is a manual, the Torah is a manual of sorts, and therefore we need to analyze every turn of phrase and understand why it is included. So these sorts of questions lead to the debates between Chazal and the Rishonim and the Achronim to this day as to what is Pshuto Shel Mikra. Many Rishonim set out to interpret Pshuto Shel Mikra, the simplest understanding of the Psukim, but they differ over matters such as these. And Rashi is a prime example of this, because Rashi repeats several times his desire to interpret Pshuto Shel Mikra, the simplest understanding of Psukim, and yet brings a far more midrashic commentary than, let's say, his grandson, the Rashbam, or his near contemporary, the Ibn Ezra. Rashi engages in a fair amount of medrash, and part of this is because of Rashi's assumptions about how the text works. So this is a prime example of it. Rashi is bothered by the yomin or small, the right and left. Just say, don't deviate. Don't deviate from anything that they tell you. Why does the pasuk add in yomin or small, right or left? Now, if you are open to the Torah using poetic language, or having a turn of phrase and an aesthetic consideration, for example, then maybe this question won't bother you. It's a way of saying, don't deviate right or left, stick to the straight and narrow. But Rashi is bothered by it. Rashi considers this a peshat question. Why should the pasuk say yamin or small? And therefore Rashi answers is teaching you don't deviate even with something as obvious as right and left. This is how Rashi interprets the pasuk, based upon his subtle reading of Psukim and his care to explain every nuance of language in Pshuto Shel Mikra. However, Rashi is basing himself on an earlier source, and I already mentioned this earlier source, because Rashi, of course, is not the first to read the Torah with the interpretive lens and try and understand what it's saying. Chazal did so also, and there are numerous collections of Chazal's statements. We are most familiar with, of course, Mishnah, a collection of the statements of Chazal, structured as a rule book. We'll give a list of laws, and it's structured in the order of rules, of sections, of tractates. All the halachas of Yom Tov are gathered together, all the halachas of Shabbos, all the halachas of damages, all the halachas of the Beis HaMikdash. This is the structure of the Mishnah. And then we've mentioned before, obviously, the Brisas, which were other collections of statements of Mishnaic rabbis, of the Tanaim, not structured in the order of Mishnayos. And one particularly important collection of statements is that of the Midrashic halachas, the Midrashei halacha. These are structured around the order of the Psukim, but they are halachically based rather than Agada. So we're familiar when someone quotes a Medrash, this is very often a story or a filling in of extra details around the text and the like. These are midrashim, but they're also midrashim, interpretive traditions of Chazal, built in the order of the Psukim. And the Sifriam is one such collection, structured around the book of Devarim, and it is the source of Rashi's quote, in which Rashi says, don't veer right or left. Afilu, again, remember the crucial words of Rashi, afilu omelacha al yamin shush smol. In fact, I'm going to share the screen again, just to, if I can find my screen share. It's disappeared now. Oh, here we are. I'm just going to share the screen again, just to bring this Rashi to clarity. Says Rashi, I'm going to highlight the Rashi. Afila omenach, bottom of the page, al yamin shehu small. Even if they tell you on right that this is left. Now listen with care to the source of Rashi, which is the Sifri. Yomin and small, afilu marim be'einecha. Al yomin shu small, al small shu yomin, shemalahem. Even if they show you something which in your eyes is right, and they say it is left, or on left, which is right, one should listen to them. So this is an important difference between the language of Rashi and the language of the Sifri. Whilst Rashi seems to say, even if they tell you on the right that it is left, in other words, it is right, and nonetheless they tell you it is left, this is what you should do. The actual source of Chazal in the Sifri says if it seems to us that this is right, but they tell you it is left, one should listen to them. So this is a nuance of a difference between Rashi and the Sifri, and I point it out simply because it's interesting that Rashi changed the language. I'm not 100% convinced that the Sifri means something different to Rashi, meaning to say that either Rashi had a different text, or Rashi was consciously coming to extend the Sifri, or he's interpreting the Sifri. And when the Sifri says, it seems to me that it is right, I should listen to them even though they say it's left, does that mean it seems to me and I'm aware that this is a judgment call? My judgment is that it's right, but they say it's to the left. And in that case, I should bow to their authority. But if I'm absolutely certain not, or does the Sifri mean even if I'm certain, I should bow to their authority? So this is the first thing, just to note that Rashi's language is different from that of the Sifri. However, we have explicit sources that talk about and take this matter very differently. By the way, I should I want to add to at this point. Someone has posted on the test on the chat group that surely it is possible for the Sanhedrin to make a mistake. In fact, there is a carbon which is given when which needs to be brought if it turns out the Sanhedrin made a mistake. We are not yet up to that point of discussion. Rashi is not arguing over here that Sanhedrin can or cannot make a mistake. He's simply talking about rabbinic authority. One should bow to them even if one is convinced, or perhaps even if one knows they are making a mistake. The discussion over here isn't, is it feasible for them to make a mistake? It's simply, what is my obligation to submit to them? Now, you may ask me, well, if they can make a mistake, why should I submit to their authority? And there's all sorts of answers to this question, which we'll see shortly. An obvious answer to this question will be because this is how systems have to work. One has to obey law, otherwise chaos breaks out, even if one is convinced that law has got it wrong. I mean, we're witnessing in one of the most powerful democracies in the world at the moment now how chaos can break loose when people take law into their own hands, even though they are firmly and utterly convinced that they are on the right in this situation. So there may be other reasons that we're not yet up to the issue of right or wrong. Rashi doesn't say here that they are definitely right. He simply says you should listen to them. However, listen to what the Yerushalmi says, because the Yerushalmi in Maseches Horios makes a very different comment. Now, the topic of Horios is a tractate in the Mishnah that deals with the authority and rulings of the Sanhedrin, including the issue of mistakes made. The part of the core topic of discussion in Maseches Horios is this carbon which is brought when a mistake is made. So if you learn Sefer Vayikra, it tells us that if b'shogeg, if by mistake, I as an individual make a mistake, I take a piece of meat which I thought was beef and shechted properly, and it turns out it wasn't shechted, or even worse, it was a non-kosher animal, and I accidentally eat it, I have to bring a carbon chatos. What happens if the whole community makes a collective mistake by relying on the judgments of Sanhedrin, and it turns out they were mistaken? Then they have to bring a par herem dovash al tzibur. There's a collective type of chatos carbon brought on a collective mistake. And this is the topic of the discussion in Horios. But amongst the Gemara discussion around this issue is a very interesting line from the Talmud Yerushalmi, who brings the following: one might have thought that if they tell you on right that it is left and left that it is right, then one should listen to them. Talmud Loma loleches yomin osmol. Our pasuk in our pasuk, lo sosim en adavar sheyagidu lecha yomin osmol. Don't veer right or left. Only when they tell you on right that it's right and left that it's left. So the Yerushalmi takes the same turn of phrase that Rashi does and says, don't veer off what they tell you, yomin or small, to the right or the left. When they acknowledge that the right is right and they acknowledge that the left is left, then follow their guidance. However, if you are convinced they are making a mistake about a basic matter of fact, of course you can't listen to them, says the Yerushalmi, because if they're telling you that right is left and left is right, then clearly something has gone wrong, and it would be inappropriate and dangerous to listen to what they are saying. So this is the view of the Yerushalmi. As I already mentioned, possibly the Sifri itself that Rashi is coming from also didn't take as strong a stance as Rashi. And we now end up with a problem. How do we resolve these two sources? We have a Rashi on the one hand, who seems to say, listen, even when they say right is left and left is right. We have a Yerushalmi on the other hand, who seems to say, no, only if they say right is right and left is left. We have a Sifra that's a little less clear, and there's a few other sources that, in the mention of, in the interest of brevity, I'm not going to go into around this topic. Incidentally, the Rambam paskins like some version of this Yerushalmi, and the Rambam speaks about a situation where someone is convinced the Sanhedrin has made a mistake and still follows the psak of the Sanhedrin. And the Rambam says this is wrong. They shouldn't follow the psak of the Sanhedrin, at least to transgress something which is forbidden. And if they do so, this counts as their own mistake, not the mistake of the Sanhedrin. So the Rambam says as follows: let's talk about the scenario where the whole community makes a mistake because the Sanhedrin has misled them. And then it turns out they have made a mistake. Says the Rambam, the whole community brings one carbon, as we just discussed, Pasukim Vayikra, Ha'helam Dover Shel Tzibur. However, the individual who followed the Sanhedrin, if they are an unlearned person who doesn't have expertise, they are joined in the collective mistake made by the leaders of the people and are participants automatically in this joint collective sacrifice. However, if they are learned people who should have known better, who have their own ability to paskin, then they have to bring their own carbon chatos because they've made separately their own mistake. In other words, they shouldn't have relied on the collective judgment of Beis Din, because Beis Din, it is true, bring a collective carbon for the collective national mistake based upon their false pasak, their mistaken pasak. But this person who's a learned person should bring their own carbon. So what we have here is a tension of sources as to what degree one is expected to follow Beis Din when one is convinced that Beis Din has made a mistake. Now, how do we answer these contradictions? How do we address these different sources? So there's a number of approaches one can take. Option number one is that this is simply a machlokas. There's an argument, like there are arguments over many matters, and Rashi's version of the Sifri disagrees with the Yerushalmi and believes that one should one should follow Beis Din even where this is against an obvious fact that right is left and left is right. And the Yerushalmi disagrees, and the Yerushalmi holds no, only follow them when their facts are correct. There are a number of other ways of resolving this contradiction, though. I've already mentioned, sort of half mentioned one of them, which is maybe there's a difference between an expert and a non-expert. An expert, someone who is capable of their own research and issuing their own rulings, about that the Yerushalmi says, then of course don't follow Beis Din if they make a mistake. A non-expert who doesn't have expertise in the subject, they should follow Beis Din because Beis Din represents the best voice they have access to on the matter, even though every instinct and every fiber of their being cries out against this. And by the way, this is something that we follow in all areas of life, this distinction. I am not a medical expert, and therefore I've taken the stance throughout Corona. I will follow the medical expertise, the consensus opinion of the vast majority of doctors, as represented by the policies the government adopt, and as represented by 3/4 of the doctors I speak to in our community. Now, there are doctors who I respect significantly, both in our own community and beyond, who take a different stance and feel that the government's policies around COVID are wrong. Some take a stance significantly more stringent, some take a stance significantly less stringent. There is a range of views in the medical community, and there's no secret around that. Now, I, as a non-expert, it makes perfect sense for me to follow the consensus. For an expert themselves, to someone who is qualified to do so, they can disagree with the consensus. In fact, they probably need to disagree with the consensus. All medical advancement, all scientific advancement has always worked by someone who is an outlier, who is willing to voice an opinion against scientific consensus, against that which is generally held, and sometimes they prove right. But for me as a non-expert, it makes sense for me to follow the consensus, even if I have an intuition on the matter. Now, I had all sorts of intuitions throughout Corona, every single one of which has proven wrong. I had an intuition when the news first came from China and even from Italy that this wasn't proved to be a big thing. The intuition about aerosols and the way of spreading didn't seem reasonable. We have all sorts of intuitions about all sorts of things in life, and we need to know as non-experts not to trust our intuitions. We can't form a judgment, even if it instinctively appears wrong, against expert judgment. So something like this appears to be the stance that the Rambam takes in resolving the different sources. An expert is entitled to, and perhaps even obligated, to follow, to disagree with Beis Din, as opposed to a non-expert who ought to follow the consensus. What happens when Beis Din refuses to follow the view of experts? Someone just asked me in the group. Well, it depends on which expertise. If this is the view of a fellow expert in halacha, then the majority of experts are entitled to disagree with a minority of experts. If they disagree with an expert in another area, for example, a matter of scientific fact or the like, that sort of brings us back to the subject of Torah, and we'll eventually address this issue. Julian wrote, what do we do when experts argue with each other? This is also going to be a matter of discussion. In the area of medicine and science and other such things, it's indeed a good question. If you have a clear consensus, it's easy. When you don't have a clear consensus, it's difficult. It's indeed a problem. And maybe then one needs to rely on one's judgments of who the greater expert is, or who the majority of experts are, or intuition, or the like. This is indeed a problem. What happens when you don't have expert consensus? However, at least in the context of Beis Din, the Sanhedrin HaGadol, the Supreme Court, this wouldn't arise because by definition, one would follow the majority view. So when experts are able to sit together, and follow a vote, then consent and debate first of all, and then follow a vote, then expert opinion will normally arrive at a majority. However, when it doesn't, indeed, one is in a mess. So this is the halachic system according to the Rambam. A non-expert should not rely on their judgment, even al yomin shismol or smol shlumin. An expert should do so. A second distinction that's possible based on the language of the Sifri, though as I said, it's arguable whether Rashi agrees with this or not, is that there's a difference between if the disagreeer is sure or the disagreeer thinks. If the disagreeer recognizes that my value judgment is such, then they should bow to the authority of the Sanhedrin. Whereas if they are convinced that this is the case, then they shouldn't bow. So this would pick up on the distinction between in the nuance of the language of the Sifri If it appears in your eyes that this is wrong, then bow to their expertise. However, if you are certain they've got their facts wrong, then don't. And there's a whole swathe of poskim that take this stance, and they talk about the difference between a ta'us b'shikol hadas, a judgment call mistake, as opposed to a ta'us b'dvar mishnah, a mistake against a specific halacha. So these are different ways of really saying the same idea with slightly different technical halachic distinctions. But basically speaking, a second way of understanding the differences. Is this a mistake in a matter of fact, or is this a mistake in a matter of opinion and judgment call? So if I'm absolutely convinced that the judgment is wrong, but I recognize it's a judgment call, that would be one distinction, as opposed to a case where I think they've got their facts completely wrong. A second distinction would be between am I certain or is my inclination? My inclination is they've got it wrong, then I should bow to their authority. Whereas if I'm certain they've got it wrong, then I shouldn't. A third distinction is the Rambam's distinction between an expert and non-expert opinion. And finally, there's some poskim that take the stance that it depends where you're up to in the judicial proceedings. One who disagrees should absolutely argue and fight their corner until a resolution has been arrived at. But once a resolution has been arrived at that point, they need to step back and recognize consensus, authority, and at that point, they should back off from persisting in pushing forward their argument. So there's a number of approaches about how to deal with this issue of the clashes in the language used by the sages, used by Chazal, as to the extent of this pasuk that says "Lo soso l'cha yomin smol," don't veer off right and left. And what I want to use the last few minutes available to us, though, is to try and understand what is the basis of this authority? Why should it be that they have such authority? And here there is language used by many of the Rishonim, all of which drifts in the same direction. However, we will start off next week by looking in depth at the language of one particular Rishon. And they all talk about it as being a reflection of how legal systems and how society has to function. So someone, as I mentioned already on the side, posted, well, surely Sanhedrin can make a mistake. Almost all the Rishonim that address this issue do not see the wide-ranging powers of the court as reflecting a belief in their infallibility. This isn't about infallibility. It's simply about how a legal and halachic system has to work. Any system can only work if people can be confident about the law and they're able to operate accordingly. And therefore, the Rishonim give this explanation. We'll look at the sources inside Emunas Hashem next week, that the basis of authority is because this is how a system has to work. You can't have everyone taking the law into their own hands. People have to receive a court judgment and then move on based upon that assumption. So this isn't about infallibility, but this is simply about how a legal system works. However, there are two additional factors mentioned by some Rishonim on this topic, and this is where we will start off next week. This first additional factor is that this is a pool of experts. So in addition to the fact that as a society you need a legislative body, and as a society you need a Supreme Court that interprets the law and then makes a final decision, and therefore even if based on other considerations you have no reason to think they're right, you can argue your corner, but then you have to behave in line with the psak of Beis Din. In addition to that, this is surely the largest gathering of experts, and therefore reason dictates that one should bow to the collection of experts and assume that they have got it wrong, even though this is counter to my judgment. This is a second factor mentioned. And a third factor mentioned is that of divine assistance and Ruach HaKodesh. And therefore next week, we are going to have to look at these sources inside and to see whether there are voices in our Masorah that do adopt a stance of infallibility. But for this week, I'll simply conclude by saying that the majority of Rishonim don't speak about this as an issue of infallibility, but speak about this as a reflection of how society needs to work, that you need a legal system and a collection of expertise. So just to summarize what we've said so far, we have now looked at the source that is so often quoted as to the authority of Das Torah, and we've begun analyzing it. And we've seen a number of questions. We've seen a question about the extent of authority, being dam ledam, being din ledin, is it only referring to halachic debate or even non-halachic issues? And even within halacha, what's the extent of authority? We've seen a question about which body has this authority granted to it. Is this only the Makom Asher Yivcha, the Sanhedrin, the great Sanhedrin that sits on the base on the Temple Mount, or is it any rabbinic body? And finally, we've seen a question about what is the extent of authority when, in my judgment, at least a mistake is made. We've seen the very commonly quoted language of Rashi, even when they say right is left and left is right. We've seen a softening of that language from the Sifri. We've seen an explicit Yerushalmi which disagrees with this and says that this is only when they say about right that it's right and left that it's left. We've seen sources that discuss how to resolve this contradiction. And finally, we've dipped our toes into what's the logic or rationale behind granting such authority to human beings. A possible stance that they indeed have some form of divine assistance and infallibility, but the mainstream view that this is a reflection of how society needs to operate and work. Next week, we will look in a little more detail at that, and then we'll try and move the discussion forward. So I'll stop there for today and wish everyone a good day. Thank you so much, as always, for joining.